At 7:03 a.m., after a 12-hour shift in the ER, I came home to a lawsuit from my own parents. They demanded I sell my $580,000 home to fund my sister's lifestyle. For years, I was their safety net, the responsible one, the one who signed a $45,000 loan agreement without question because they told me my sister's life was on the line. They were counting on my compassion as a nurse. They never counted on my training as a clinician, the part of me that knows how to read the fine print, and the medical charts. The legal papers felt heavier than they should, the crisp edges sharp against my numb fingers. At 7:03 a.m. after a 12-hour shift in the ER, this was my welcome home. The silence in my apartment was a physical thing, a stark contrast to the relentless beeping of monitors and the desperate calls that filled my workday. This was the one place on earth where I could decompress, where nothing was demanded of me. It was a peace I had built for myself, paycheck by paycheck, overtime shift by overtime shift. Now that peace was shattered by the official seal of the Denver County Court. My mind was still a catalog of the night's chaos. A multi-car pileup on the I-25, a child with acute respiratory failure and a cardiac arrest in Bay 3. I had spent the last 12 hours making life-or-death decisions, holding my team together through sheer force of will. I thought I had left the chaos behind when I walked out of the hospital doors. I was wrong. The chaos had followed me home wearing the faces of my own parents. I sank onto a kitchen stool, forcing myself to read the words my brain refused to process. Plaintiff Frank and Carol Miller. My father and mother. Defendant Maya Miller. Me. The document was dense with legal jargon, but the core demand was brutally simple. They were petitioning the court to force the sale of my property, my home. The reason they claimed was to prevent a catastrophic financial hardship within the family. I knew exactly what that meant. It had always meant the same thing. Paige. My sister, my beautiful, volatile, perpetually in crisis sister. The golden child who could do no wrong even when everything she did was wrong. The lawsuit was a tangle of half-truths and emotional manipulations, painting a picture of Paige on the verge of destitution after her recent divorce. It spoke of her emotional fragility, her inability to cope, and the family's duty to rally around her. And apparently my primary duty was to liquidate my single greatest asset, the cornerstone of my entire adult life, to bail her out of her latest mess. A cold, familiar anger began to burn through the initial shock. I thought of the down payment I had saved for over a decade, living in tiny rundown apartments while Paige traveled through Europe on our parents' dime. I thought of the renovations I did myself, learning how to tile a bathroom from online videos because I could not afford a contractor. Every square inch of this place was built on my own sweat and sacrifice. It was the physical proof that I, the overlooked daughter, could not only survive but thrive on my own. And now they wanted to take it away. Not for a medical emergency, not for a true, unavoidable crisis, but because Paige had once again driven her life into a ditch and expected me to be the tow truck. I read the final paragraph, a formal declaration that my parents believed they had a rightful moral claim to my assets in a time of family need. They were suing me. For Paige. I needed to understand how we got here and what they truly believed gave them the right. My hand instinctively went to my phone. I had to call them. I had to hear them say it themselves. My thumb hovered over my mother's contact photo, the phone feeling cold in my hand. Before I could press it, a vivid memory flooded my mind as sharp and unwelcome as the lawsuit itself. It was from just 3 months ago, a Sunday dinner that felt less like a family gathering and more like a strategic briefing. I had brought a bottle of wine, a peace offering for a war I didn't know had been declared. Paige was already there, her face tear-streaked and puffy. My father sat at the head of the table, his expression grim while my mother fluttered around Paige, refilling her water glass and stroking her hair. The story came out in a torrent of sobs and accusations. Her husband was leaving her. He was being cruel, unreasonable. He was trying to take everything. Through it all, my parents murmured their sympathies, nodding along to Paige's version of events. I listened quietly, the practiced silence of a lifetime of being the supporting character. When Paige finally exhausted herself, 3 pairs of eyes turned to me. The expectation was suffocating. My mother's voice was soft, but the words were heavy. She said Paige was just so fragile that she would need a lot of support to get through this. My father added that in times like these, family had to step up. They weren't asking a question. It was a statement of fact, my fact. That night, I just nodded and said I would help however I could. I was thinking of Resume Help, a temporary place to stay emotional support. I was naive enough to believe that was what they meant. Now, with the lawsuit in front of me, another more painful memory surfaced. It was from about 5 years ago, a panicked late-night call from my mother. Her voice was thin with manufactured terror. She told me Paige was sick. They had seen a specialist, she said, and it was a rare condition. There was an experimental therapy, a new treatment, but the insurance wouldn't cover it. The words were a blur of medical-sounding terms designed to both confuse and frighten. They played my compassion like a finely tuned instrument. They knew a crisis, especially a medical one, was my kryptonite. The next day, we met at their bank. My father slid a stack of papers across the table, explaining it was a personal loan to cover Paige's treatments. He told me they just needed my signature as a formality, a co-signer to secure the amount. I remember the urgency in his eyes, the way my mother clutched my hand, her knuckles white. I was a nurse. My entire life was dedicated to healing, to fixing, to alleviating suffering. How could I say no? I signed. I signed without reading the fine print because I believed I was saving my sister's life. I signed because that is what you do when your family is facing a medical crisis, especially when you are a nurse. My resolve hardened as the memories settled. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I pressed my mother's name on the screen. She answered on the second ring, her voice a practiced blend of concern and fragility. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told her I had received the papers from their lawyer. A soft gasp came through the speaker as if she were the one who had been wronged. She said, "Oh, honey, I am so sorry you had to find out that way. We were going to tell you." Her apology was as empty as the excuses I had heard my entire life. I kept my voice steady, the same tone I used in the ER to de-escalate a panicked family member. I asked her to explain why they were suing their own daughter. Her voice began to tremble, a classic tactic. She started talking about Paige, about how lost and broken she was. She said they were desperate, that they had explored every other option. It was a performance, and for the first time, I was not just a member of the audience. I was the critic. I asked her, what other options did you explore? Mom, did you suggest Paige get a job? Did you consider taking out a loan on your own home, the one you have lived in for 30 years? The line went quiet for a beat. Then, my father's voice, stern and booming, took over the call. He said, "Now, you listen here, Maya. This is not about being fair. This is about what is necessary. Your sister is in trouble." He spoke of duty and obligation, his words painting me as selfish and ungrateful for even questioning their plan. He told me it was my role as the older, more stable daughter, to provide the safety net. He said I was stronger, that I was built for this kind of pressure. The phrase hung in the air, a perfect summary of my entire existence in their eyes. I was not a person to them. I was a resource, a utility. As he lectured me, my eyes scanned my apartment. I had spent the weekend before last carefully organizing my bookshelves, arranging novels by author and medical texts by subject. While I was doing that, my hand had brushed against a sealed cardboard box in the back of my hall closet. It was full of old financial documents and photo albums my parents had asked me to store a few years ago while they had their basement renovated for Paige to move back in after one of her breakups. They had never bothered to take it back. It was just another piece of their lives they had offloaded onto me for safekeeping. At the time, I had not thought anything of it. It was just another box. My father was still talking, his voice rising in frustration at my silence. He ended with a final, chilling statement. He told me they had to do this for Paige's own good. And then he hung up. No goodbye. No I love you. Just the cold, hard finality of their decision. The call ended, but the conversation was far from over. I stood up and walked to the hall closet, my mind racing. They had made it clear they saw my life as a resource to be plundered for their benefit. They had no idea just how many resources they had left in my care. I opened the closet door and pulled the heavy box out into the light. The silence that followed the phone call was heavier than the box sitting on my living room floor. The finality in my father's voice echoed in my ears, a clear declaration that the lines had been drawn. I knew I couldn't open that box yet. Doing so felt like a definitive act of war, and a small, wounded part of me was not quite ready to launch a counter-offensive. First, I had to understand the scope of their attack. I had to see how far they were willing to go. I did not have to wait long to find out. The next day, the digital assault began. It started with a text from my Aunt Carol, my mother's sister. It was deceptively casual, asking how I was doing. But then came the pivot. She said she had heard about the situation with Paige and that she was so worried about my parents. She said they were just trying to hold the family together. The message was clear. I was the one breaking it apart. I replied politely but vaguely, not giving her any ammunition. But the texts kept coming, each one a little more pointed, a little more guilt-inducing. Then the wider family network was activated. Uncles I had not spoken to in years started leaving voicemails. Cousins sent messages on social media. The narrative was always the same, a carefully curated story where I was the cold, successful daughter who had forgotten where she came from. Paige was the victim, and my parents were the noble saviors being thwarted by my selfishness. They were methodically and efficiently poisoning the well, turning every potential ally against me before I even had a chance to tell my side of the story. The climax of this campaign came in the form of a Facebook post from Paige. She did not use my name, but she did not need to. It was a long, rambling post accompanied by a picture of her looking pale and sad. She wrote about the pain of being abandoned by those who are supposed to love you most. She talked about how some people measure love in dollars and property values while others like her just want a family to lean on. The comments section was a tidal wave of sympathy and outrage directed at the anonymous, heartless sister. Friends of my parents' distant relatives and Paige's own circle of friends chimed in with messages of support for her and condemnation for me. Words like selfish, cruel, and ungrateful were thrown around with ease. I scrolled through the comments, my stomach twisting into a tight, painful knot. This was not just a lawsuit anymore. This was a public shaming. They were not just trying to take my home. They were trying to dismantle my character, my reputation, my relationships. They wanted to isolate me so completely that I would have no choice but to surrender. Every notification on my phone felt like another stone being thrown. They were building a wall of public opinion around me brick by painful brick, hoping to leave me with no one to turn to and nowhere to go. And in that manufactured isolation, I understood. They would not stop until they got what they wanted. The social media campaign was designed to break my spirit, but years in the ER had taught me how to function in a crisis. You learn to wall off the emotional noise and focus on the immediate threat. I blocked the numbers of relatives who sent harassing texts. I deactivated my Facebook account, silencing the chorus of judgment with a single click. For a few days, a fragile peace returned. I threw myself into my work, finding a strange comfort in the controlled chaos of the hospital. There, the problems were clear. The solutions, though difficult, were based on logic and training. I started to hope that maybe, just maybe, they would run out of steam and realize this was a battle they could not win. That hope was obliterated on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the middle of charting a critical patient when one of the junior nurses, a young woman named Sarah, approached my station. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and embarrassment. She told me there was someone here to see me. My first thought was that a patient's family member had a complaint. Then she said, "It is your sister." My blood ran cold. I walked out to the waiting area, a place I normally associated with anxious families and quiet grief. Paige was standing in the center of the room, dressed in clothes that were deliberately designed to look both expensive and disheveled. She was not crying, but she had a look of righteous fury on her face. The moment she saw me, she raised her voice, ensuring everyone in the packed waiting room could hear. She started yelling about how I could stand there pretending to care for strangers while my own sister was about to be homeless. She accused me of being heartless, of valuing an apartment over my own flesh and blood. People stared. Patients waiting in wheelchairs, families clutching coffee cups, my own colleagues peeking out from behind doorways. My professional world, the one I had built with such meticulous care, was colliding with the toxic mess of my family life in the most public way possible. I tried to lead her away, my voice low and urgent, telling her this was not the time or the place. But she yanked her arm away. She said this was the only place she could find me since I was ignoring her calls. She screamed that I was a disgrace, that I had always been jealous of her, and that I would be sorry when our parents died knowing I had turned my back on them. The head of our department, Dr. Evans, a man I deeply respected, emerged from his office. He took one look at the scene and immediately signaled for security. As two guards gently but firmly escorted a still shouting Paige out of the building, I stood frozen in the middle of the waiting room. The silence she left behind was deafening. Every eye was on me, a mixture of pity, curiosity, and judgment. I felt exposed, humiliated. They had not just built a wall around me anymore. They had breached the final fortress. They had invaded the one place I thought was safe, the one place that was truly mine. And in that moment, I knew this was no longer about holding firm. This was about fighting back. The drive home from the hospital was a blur. I do not remember the traffic or the route I took. All I could see was the scene in the waiting room replaying in my mind on a loop. The faces of my colleagues, the stares of the patients, the triumphant smirk on Paige's face as she was led away. It was a calculated act of sabotage designed to inflict maximum damage. By the time I walked into my apartment, the humiliation had burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard resolve. The woman who had hoped for a peaceful resolution was gone. In her place was someone who finally understood the stakes. I collapsed onto my couch, the exhaustion of the past few weeks hitting me all at once. I felt utterly alone, cornered by a family that seemed intent on destroying me. Just as the despair began to set in, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my best friend Zoe. It just said, "I am on my way. Do not say no." 20 minutes later, she was at my door with a bag of takeout and a bottle of wine. She took one look at my face and did not ask what was wrong. She just said, "Tell me everything." And I did. I told her about the lawsuit, the phone calls, the social media campaign, and finally the horrific scene at the hospital. Zoe listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with every detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked me straight in the eye. She said, "This is not family pressure, Maya. This is a coordinated attack. What Paige did today, that was not an emotional outburst. It was a strategy. They are trying to make your life so unbearable that giving in feels like the only way to make it stop." Her words cut through my emotional fog. She was right. This was not a dispute. It was a siege. Just then, my phone rang again. The caller ID showed it was Dr. Evans, my department head. I hesitated, but Zoe nodded for me to answer. His voice was calm and professional. He asked if I was okay. He told me not to worry about what happened, that the staff knew who I was, and that this incident would not reflect on my record. Then he said something that changed everything. He told me a few years ago he had gone through a nasty legal battle with a business partner. He said it is one thing to fight an enemy, but it is another to fight someone who knows all your weaknesses. He gave me the name and number of his lawyer. He said she was tough, smart, and did not tolerate bullies. I looked at the name he had texted me. Elena Vasquez. It felt like the first real weapon I had been given in this entire fight. Meeting Elena Vasquez was like stepping into a different world. Her office was all clean lines and cool glass, a stark contrast to the organic chaos of my life. She was sharp, direct, and radiated an intimidating competence that immediately put me at ease. I explained everything from the initial lawsuit to the scene at the hospital. She listened intently, her face betraying nothing, but her eyes missed nothing. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. She told me their lawsuit to force the sale of my home was frivolous and would likely be thrown out, but she warned the harassment was a different story. It was real, it was damaging, and it was our leverage. She gave me a simple instruction. Go home and gather everything, every text, every email, every voicemail, and any financial documents, contracts, or agreements I had ever made with or for my family. She said the key to fighting manipulators is to dismantle their narrative with cold, hard facts. I left her office with a renewed sense of purpose. The fear was still there, but now it was overshadowed by a clear objective. Back in my apartment, I knew exactly where to start. The box. The heavy cardboard box my parents had left in my closet years ago. I dragged it into the middle of my living room and sliced open the packing tape. The top layer was a time capsule of my childhood. Old photo albums filled with awkward school pictures, my father's old tax records, my mother's collection of recipes. For a moment, a wave of nostalgia washed over me. It felt like I was looking at evidence of a family that once existed, a family I desperately wished was real. I pushed the albums aside. Deeper in the box, I found a collection of manila folders neatly labeled. One was marked Household Finances. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside, nestled among old utility bills and bank statements, was a folder labeled Page. And inside that folder was the loan agreement. The $45,000 personal loan I had co-signed 5 years ago. My signature was right there, a clear, trusting script. The stated purpose on the document was for family medical expenses. My heart began to pound. I kept digging. Beneath the loan agreement was another thicker stack of papers held together by a binder clip. They were bank statements from that same period. I spread them out on the floor. I saw the loan amount $45,000 deposited into a joint account my parents had set up. And then I saw the very next transaction dated just 2 days later. A wire transfer for the full amount minus a few dollars in fees sent not to a hospital or a clinic, but to something called Zenith Wellness Ventures LLC. I had never heard of it, but I did remember Paige years ago trying to recruit me into some new health supplement business she was so excited about. An MLM. There were no other transactions, no payments to specialists, no pharmacy charges, no medical bills of any kind. It was all there in black and white. The rare disease, the experimental therapy, the panicked phone call, it was all a lie. A carefully constructed $45,000 lie. They had not just taken my money, they had taken the most sacred part of me, my instinct to heal my compassion as a nurse, and they had twisted it into a weapon to fund my sister's get-rich-quick scheme. The full weight of the betrayal settled in my chest heavy and suffocating. My grief was not just for the money. It was for the daughter who had believed them. The revelation about the loan left me breathless, sitting on my floor, surrounded by the paper trail of their deceit. The anger was so potent, it felt like a physical presence in the room. I thought I had found the bottom, the absolute lowest point of their betrayal. I was wrong. The bottom was much deeper and darker than I could have ever imagined. Fueled by adrenaline and a desperate need to know the full extent of their deception, I turned my attention back to the box. I worked through the remaining folders with a grim determination, my movements mechanical. Most of it was mundane. Old car titles, mortgage documents for their house, Paige's high school report cards. I almost missed it. Tucked inside a thick folder labeled Estate Planning was a thinner, newer-looking folder. It had no label. My instincts, honed by years of assessing critical situations in the ER, screamed at me. I opened it. The first page was a cover sheet from a life insurance company. The name on the policy was mine. Maya Miller. I felt a wave of dizziness, my vision momentarily tunneling. I forced myself to focus to read the details. The policy had been taken out just over 2 years ago, shortly after I had been promoted to head nurse. The coverage amount was $500,000, a number that felt obscene, terrifying. I scanned down to the section that listed the beneficiaries. My breath hitched in my throat. Frank Miller, Carol Miller, and Paige Miller. Equal shares. I dropped the papers as if they were on fire. A strangled noise escaped my lips, a sound I did not recognize as my own. This was not about helping Paige. This was not about family duty. This was something monstrous. They had looked at my promotion, my increased salary, my stability, and they had not seen a daughter to be proud of. They had seen an asset to be leveraged. They had calculated my worth not in love or affection, but in a cold, hard dollar amount that would only be paid out upon my death. Suddenly, 100 small, unsettling moments from the past 2 years clicked into place with horrifying clarity. My mother's sudden insistence that I get a full physical every year. My father's casual questions about my work schedule, the late nights, the long hours. Paige's offhand comments about how stressful my job must be, how I needed to take care of myself. I had interpreted it all as a clumsy newfound concern for my well-being. Now I saw it for what it was. They were not worried about me. They were protecting their investment. The anger I felt about the loan evaporated, replaced by a profound and chilling fear. The people who had given me life, the people who were supposed to protect me above all others, had placed a price tag on my death. The lawsuit, the harassment, the public humiliation, it all made a terrible kind of sense now. In their minds, I was already just a collection of assets. My apartment was a liquid resource for their immediate needs. My life was a long-term policy for their future security. I was not their daughter. I was their contingency plan. And as I sat there in the quiet of my apartment, the full weight of that realization crashed down on me. I was not just fighting for my home anymore. I was fighting for my life. The fear that gripped me after finding the insurance policy was primal. For the rest of the night, I sat in silence, the documents spread out before me like the scene of a crime. But as the sun began to cast a gray dawn over the city, the fear started to recede, replaced by something else. A cold, surgical calm. The kind of calm I felt in the ER when a mass casualty event was called, and panic was a luxury no one could afford. The part of me that was a grieving daughter died that night. The part of me that was a survivor, a fighter, took control. I did not sleep. Instead, I gathered every piece of evidence. I carefully placed the fraudulent loan documents and the life insurance policy into a new clean folder. I printed out the text messages from my relatives, the screenshots of Paige's Facebook post, and wrote a detailed chronological account of the harassment campaign. I made copies of everything, creating a digital backup on a secure encrypted drive. I was no longer just a victim reacting to their attacks. I was a clinician building a case documenting every symptom of the sickness that had infected my family. The next morning, I was at Elena Vasquez's office before it even opened the folder clutched in my hand. I did not need to say a word. The look on my face must have told her everything. She led me straight into her conference room. I laid out the new evidence on the polished table, the loan papers on one side, the insurance policy on the other. She read through them in silence, her expression unreadable at first. Then, as she finished the last page of the insurance policy, she looked up at me. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something beyond professional detachment in her eyes. It was a cold, controlled anger. She took a deep breath. She said, "Maya, this changes everything. What started as a harassment case has now crossed the line into felony fraud and something far more disturbing." Her voice was steady, but it carried a new weight. She explained the legal ramifications of what my parents had done. The loan was a clear case of wire fraud. The insurance policy, while not illegal to take out, became sinister evidence of their long-term intent when combined with the lawsuit and the fraud. It painted a picture of a calculated multi-year plan to exploit me for financial gain, both in life and in death. She looked at me, her gaze direct and unwavering. She told me we had two options. We could use this evidence as leverage to make their lawsuit disappear quietly. Or we could fight back. We could file a countersuit so comprehensive and so damning that they would regret the day they ever thought of me as an easy target. She warned me that the second path would be harder. It would be emotionally brutal, and it would burn the final bridge between me and my family forever. There was no hesitation. The bridges were already ashes. They had burned them down themselves with every lie, every threat, every act of betrayal. I looked Elena straight in the eye. I said, I want to fight back. I want to make sure they can never do this to me or to anyone else ever again. A slow, thin smile spread across her face. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator that had just been given permission to hunt. She said, "Good. That is what I was hoping you would say. Now let us get to work." The weeks that followed were a masterclass in strategic warfare orchestrated by Elena. while she and her team drafted the countersuit, a formidable document detailing every transgression from harassment to felony fraud. My role was to remain silent. It was one of the hardest things I had ever had to do. The instinct to scream, to confront, to show them what I had discovered was a constant burning pressure in my chest, but Elena was adamant. "We do not show them our weapons until we are ready to strike. Let them think their intimidation is working. Let them grow complacent." So I played the part of the beaten daughter. I did not respond to any new texts from my extended family. I kept my head down at work, focusing on my patients with a singular intensity that left little room for anything else. To the outside world, and more importantly to my family, I had simply gone quiet. I knew they would interpret my silence as weakness, as a sign that I was buckling under the pressure. That was exactly what we wanted. The first move was not a cannon blast, but a quiet, precise scalpel cut. Elena's office sent a formal response to my parents' lawyer. It was a deliberately understated document. It did not mention the loan fraud or the life insurance policy. It simply stated that we rejected their lawsuit's claims as baseless and without merit. It noted the pattern of harassment and informed them that we would be seeking to have their case dismissed in court. Tucked into the final paragraph was a single, carefully worded sentence. It read, "We are also in the process of compiling evidence for a potential countersuit regarding a number of related and unrelated financial matters." It was a warning shot veiled in bland, legal language. Elena explained the strategy. We were giving their lawyer, and by extension them, a chance to reconsider. A competent attorney would read that line and immediately ask my parents what other financial matters might exist. He would press them for the truth. We were testing their arrogance. Would they be smart enough to be scared, or would they be so convinced of their own righteousness that they would ignore the threat? For 2 days, there was nothing. A profound, unnerving silence. I found myself checking my email every 5 minutes, my stomach in a constant state of low-grade anxiety. Then, on the 3rd day, a message arrived from Elena. It just said they took the bait. Their lawyer replied. He called our letter an obvious and desperate bluff. He stated his clients were confident in their position and intended to proceed aggressively. A strange sense of relief washed over me, eclipsing the anxiety. They had not listened. Their arrogance, their lifelong belief that I would simply absorb their actions and carry their burdens had made them blind. They had walked right past the warning sign and straight toward the trap we had set for them. The silence from my family was no longer the silence of a predator waiting. It was the silence of prey, completely unaware that the roles were about to be reversed. They thought they had cornered me. They had no idea I was the one who had just locked the door. The day of the preliminary hearing felt surreal. I walked into the courthouse, my footsteps echoing in the marble hallway, feeling a strange disconnect from my own body. Elena was a calming presence beside me, her briefcase filled with the ammunition we had so carefully prepared. When we entered the courtroom, I saw them, my parents and Paige sitting together on a bench on the opposite side of the room. They looked smaller here, stripped of the familiar power dynamic of their own home. My father wore a suit that was slightly too tight. My mother clutched a tissue in her hand, and Paige stared straight ahead, a defiant pout on her face. None of them looked at me. Their lawyer went first, his voice filled with a rehearsed, patronizing tone. He painted a picture of a loving, concerned family simply trying to help a daughter in distress Paige while being stonewalled by another me. He spoke of family duty and moral obligation, framing their lawsuit as a last resort to appeal to my better nature. He made it sound as if they were the victims forced into this unfortunate situation by my cold indifference. I sat perfectly still, my hands clasped in my lap, and let him build his fantasy. Then it was Elena's turn. She stood up, her movements calm and deliberate. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She began by systematically dismantling their case, presenting evidence of my sole ownership of my property and my consistent refusal to sell. Then she shifted her focus. She said, "Your Honor, this case is not about a daughter's duty. It is about a pattern of financial and emotional exploitation." And with that, she projected a document onto the screen for the judge to see. It was the $45,000 loan agreement, the one with my signature clearly stating the funds were for medical expenses. My mother flinched a small, almost imperceptible movement. My father's jaw tightened. Paige's eyes widened slightly. Elena let the image hang in the air for a moment before she continued. She explained that this loan was taken out under false pretenses. She then presented the next exhibit. The bank statement showing the full amount being transferred to Zenith Wellness Ventures, Paige's failed MLM. A quiet murmur went through the small courtroom. The judge, an older woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, leaned forward, her gaze fixed on the screen. She looked from the document to my parents, a flicker of something hard and questioning in her expression. My parents' lawyer stood up to object, calling the evidence irrelevant to the matter at hand. But the damage was done. We had fired our first real shot and it had hit its mark. This was no longer a simple family dispute over property. We had just introduced the first piece of evidence that this was about a calculated, premeditated lie. And we were just getting started. My parents' lawyer was visibly flustered. He tried to argue that the loan was a separate family matter, a misunderstanding that had nothing to do with the current lawsuit. He insisted his clients had acted in good faith to support their daughter Paige through what they believed was a medical crisis. The judge listened, her expression impassive, but her eyes held a new sharp scrutiny as she looked at my parents. My father shifted in his seat, his usual air of authority replaced by a nervous energy. My mother was now twisting the tissue in her hands into a shredded mess. Elena let their lawyer finish his sputtering defense. Then she rose again, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to his agitation. She addressed the judge. She said, "Your Honor, the defense claims my client's actions were born from a place of love and concern. They wish to paint a picture of a family doing whatever it takes to protect their own. I would now like to introduce an exhibit that speaks directly to their definition of protection and family value." She clicked a button and a new document replaced the bank statement on the screen. It was the cover page of the life insurance policy. My name, Maya Miller, was in bold, clear print. The coverage amount, $500,000, seemed to hang in the air, electric and obscene. The list of beneficiaries, Frank Carroll and Paige Miller, was undeniable. If the loan document had caused a murmur, this caused a profound, chilling silence. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. I risked a glance at my family. My father's face was ashen, a sickly gray color I recognized from patients in cardiogenic shock. My mother looked as if she had been struck, her mouth slightly open, her eyes wide with disbelief that this secret had been brought into the light. Paige simply stared at the screen, her defiant expression finally crumbling into something that looked like genuine fear. Their lawyer just stood there speechless. He looked from the screen to his clients and back again, his face a mask of confusion and dawning horror. It was clear this was the first he was seeing of it. My parents had not told him. They had not told him because they knew on some level that this was indefensible. Elena's voice cut through the silence, sharp and precise. She said this policy was taken out just after my client was promoted to head nurse. It demonstrates a long-term pattern of viewing my client not as a daughter to be cherished, but as a financial asset to be secured. Their lawsuit is not an act of desperation. It is the next logical step in a long history of exploitation. First, they leveraged her compassion for a fraudulent loan. Now they are trying to liquidate her primary asset, her home, all while holding a policy that designates her value to them in the event of her death. The room was cold, silent. The judge's gaze was fixed on my parents, and for the first time, I saw them for what they truly were. Not my mother and father, just two strangers on the other side of a courtroom. The weight of the insurance policy hung in the courtroom, a tangible thing. My parents' lawyer, looking completely defeated, stammered a few weak objections about relevance, but the judge waved him into silence with an impatient flick of her wrist. The narrative they had so carefully constructed had been utterly demolished. There was no coming back from this. Seeing the case slipping away, my mother resorted to their oldest and most reliable tactic melodrama. She let out a loud, theatrical sob, her hand flying to her chest. She gasped for air, her eyes wide and panicked. She said, "I can't breathe. My heart. The stress of all this, it's too much." My father immediately rushed to her side, playing his part, looking at the judge with an expression of terrified concern. It was a desperate last-ditch effort to garner sympathy to shift their role from perpetrators to victims. It was a performance I had seen in various forms my entire life whenever Paige was in trouble, or whenever they needed to manipulate a situation to their advantage. In the past, I would have felt a jolt of anxiety, the ingrained responsibility of a daughter and a nurse kicking in. But now all I felt was a cold, clear focus. They had used my medical compassion against me to get the loan. Now they were attempting to use a fake medical emergency to escape the consequences. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. I was done being a silent observer. I leaned forward and whispered to Elena. She listened, her eyes widening slightly before a small, almost imperceptible nod of approval. She stood. "Your Honor, my client, as a head nurse with 15 years of experience in emergency medicine, has an observation she would like to share with the court." The judge looked at me, her expression a mixture of surprise and curiosity. She gestured for me to proceed. I stood up, my voice as steady and clinical as if I were delivering a patient report during morning rounds. I said, "Your Honor, I am observing the woman across the room. She is claiming to have cardiac distress. Her stated symptoms are shortness of breath and chest pain. However, her skin tone is not pale or ashen. She is not diaphoretic, which means sweating, and her respiratory rate is well within normal limits. There are no objective signs of a true medical emergency." I paused, letting my professional assessment settle in the silent room. I looked directly at my mother, whose performance had faltered, her eyes now wide with shock. I finished. What the court is witnessing is not a medical condition. It is a calculated display of emotional manipulation, a tactic often used to deflect accountability. The courtroom was utterly still. I had not raised my voice. I had not accused. I had simply presented a diagnosis. I had used the skills they had exploited the very core of my professional identity to dismantle their final lie. My father stared at me, his face a mask of disbelief. My mother had stopped crying. She just looked at me, stripped of her last weapon. The judge's gaze was sharp, her expression leaving no doubt. The performance was over, and the truth, in all its cold clinical clarity, had finally won. My clinical takedown of my mother's performance was the final blow. The energy in the courtroom shifted irrevocably. There was no more pretense, no more room for manipulation. There was only the stark evidence and the undeniable truth. The judge, her face a stern mask of disapproval, looked at my parents' lawyer and simply said, "Do you have anything else?" The man, looking utterly deflated, just shook his head and mumbled, "No, Your Honor." The judge did not waste any time. She did not need to deliberate. She addressed my parents directly, her voice sharp and devoid of any sympathy. She said, "In all my years on the bench, I have rarely seen a case so profoundly illustrative of familial exploitation. The original lawsuit filed by you is not just dismissed. It is dismissed with prejudice, meaning you can never bring this baseless claim before a court again." She then turned her attention to our countersuit. She found in our favor on every single count: harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and fraud. She ordered them to repay the full $45,000 loan with all accrued interest calculated from the date of the wire transfer. She ordered them to pay for all of my legal fees, ensuring I would not lose a single penny defending myself against their greed. And she awarded me an additional sum for punitive damages, a clear punishment for the calculated cruelty of their actions. But she was not finished. She looked at them, her gaze hardening. She said, "What is most disturbing is the clear evidence of criminal activity. Forgery and wire fraud are serious felonies. While this is a civil court, I am ethically bound to refer this matter to the district attorney's office for a full criminal investigation. I strongly suggest," she added, her voice dropping to a near whisper that carried more weight than any shout, "that you begin making restitution immediately. It will be the only thing that might convince a prosecutor you feel any remorse whatsoever." Finally, she granted our request for a permanent restraining order. My parents and my sister were legally forbidden from contacting me from coming within 500 feet of my home or my workplace. The legal shield I so desperately needed was now in place. The judge banged her gavel, the sound echoing through the silent courtroom. It was final. As the court was adjourned, I just sat there for a moment, letting the wave of relief wash over me. It was not a feeling of triumph or joy. It was the feeling of a heavy, crushing weight being lifted from my soul. I had not won a battle against my family. I had survived it. I had survived them. As we stood to leave, my father tried to catch my eye from across the room, his face a mixture of anger and disbelief. I did not look at him. I turned and walked out of the courtroom with Elena, leaving the wreckage of my old life behind me for good. The aftermath of the court ruling was swift and decisive. The world my parents had built, a world propped up by my forced sacrifices and Paige's endless needs, began to crumble. The restraining order was the first tangible change, a legal wall that brought an immediate and blessed silence to my life. The constant barrage of texts, calls, and guilt-laden messages stopped. My phone no longer felt like a weapon aimed at me. News travels fast in a family, even a fractured one. The relatives who had been so quick to condemn me were suddenly silent, confronted with the ugly truth of the court's findings. The narrative my parents had so carefully crafted had been publicly exposed as a lie. A few of the more distant cousins sent awkward, tentative apology messages, which I read and then deleted without replying. The time for taking sides was long over. The financial consequences hit my parents the hardest. The court-ordered repayments were substantial, far more than they could manage on their fixed retirement income. Within a month, a for-sale sign appeared on the lawn of my childhood home. The house where I had grown up, filled with so many complicated memories, was being sold to pay for their deception. I felt a strange pang of sadness, not for them, but for the loss of a place that should have been a sanctuary but had so often felt like a cage. For Paige, the impact was even more direct. With the family home being sold and my parents' finances in ruin, her safety net was gone. The endless stream of money that had funded her whims and bailed her out of trouble had finally run dry. According to Zoe, who had a friend who knew someone in Paige's circle, my sister had been forced to get a job for the first time in her adult life. She was working as a cashier at a high-end clothing boutique, a place she used to shop at, not work at. She had moved out of her expensive apartment and into a small one-bedroom unit in a less fashionable part of the city. The princess had been exiled from her castle. The most significant consequence, however, was the looming criminal investigation. The district attorney's office had indeed opened a case file. The threat of actual charges of potential jail time for my elderly parents was very real. They had tried to destroy my world to preserve their own, but in their arrogance they had miscalculated. They had pushed me so far that I had no choice but to push back with the full force of the law. They had lit the match, and now their own house was burning down. I did not feel pleasure in their downfall. I just felt a profound, quiet finality. They had made their choices, and now, for the first time, they were being forced to live with the consequences. With the storm finally over, the real work began. Not the work of fighting, but the work of healing. The silence from my family was a relief, but it also left a void, a space filled with the echoes of a lifetime of dysfunction. I realized that winning in court was only the first step. Now I had to learn how to live in the peace I had fought so hard to secure. On Elena's recommendation, I found a therapist who specialized in family trauma. Her name was Dr. Anya Sharma, and our weekly sessions became as vital to my recovery as any medical procedure. In the quiet of her office, I began to unpack the weight I had carried for so long. I spoke about the constant pressure to be the responsible one, the feeling of my own achievements being minimized, and the deep unspoken understanding that my purpose was to be Paige's safety net. Dr. Sharma gave me the language for my experiences. She called it parentification, a dynamic where a child is forced to assume the role of the adult. She helped me see that the anger and grief I felt were not just about the lawsuit, but about the theft of my childhood, the theft of my right to be cared for instead of always being the caretaker. Slowly, I began to rebuild my life outside the courtroom and the therapist's office. I started consciously investing my time and energy into relationships that were reciprocal, relationships that nourished me instead of draining me. Zoe, my steadfast friend who had been my anchor through the entire ordeal, became the cornerstone of what I started to think of as my chosen family. We established a standing Sunday brunch tradition, a simple ritual that felt more sacred than any forced holiday gathering ever had. I also reconnected with colleagues from the hospital, people I had kept at a professional distance for years. I started joining them for coffee after a long shift, sharing stories that had nothing to do with patients or procedures. I discovered that beneath their scrubs and professional demeanors were kind, funny, and supportive people who saw me as more than just their head nurse. One evening, about 2 months after the ruling, I hosted a small dinner party in my apartment. It was the first time I had entertained in over a year. I invited Dr. Evans and his wife and a few of the nurses I had grown close to. As I looked around my living room at the smiling faces and the easy laughter filling the space I had fought to protect, I felt a sense of contentment that was deeper than just relief. The ghosts of old expectations and resentments were gone, replaced by the warmth of genuine connection. My home was no longer a fortress to be defended. It was finally becoming a sanctuary, a place filled not with obligation, but with joy. 6 months after the court case, my life had settled into a rhythm I had never known before. It was a rhythm defined by peace, not by crisis. The criminal investigation into my parents had concluded. Given their age and the fact that they had begun making court-ordered restitution by selling their home, the district attorney opted not to press charges, a decision Elena had predicted. It was a quiet end to a violent chapter, and I was grateful for it. The silence from my parents and Paige remained absolute, enforced by the restraining order. I thought that part of my life was permanently closed. Then an email arrived in my inbox. It was not from them, but from Elena. The subject line just said, "For your consideration." Inside was a forwarded message. The original sender was Paige. My heart gave a painful thud against my ribs. Elena had included a brief note explaining that Paige had contacted her respecting the legal barrier between us. Elena had reviewed the letter to ensure it contained no demands or harassment before passing it along to me. She made it clear I was under no obligation to read it, much less respond. For a full day, I left the email unopened. I was terrified that whatever was inside would shatter the fragile peace I had so carefully constructed. Part of me wanted to just delete it and move on. But another part, the clinician in me, the part that needed all the data before making a diagnosis, knew I had to read it. With a deep breath, I opened the message. The letter was nothing like I expected. There was no blame, no manipulation, no subtle digs. It was awkward, halting, and deeply uncomfortable. Paige wrote that she had started going to therapy, forced to confront her life after hitting rock bottom. She said for the first time she was beginning to understand the profound difference in how we were raised. She wrote about her own crippling fear of failure, a fear that our parents had enabled by never allowing her to fail. She acknowledged the loan calling it what it was, a theft born from her own entitlement. She apologized for the scene at the hospital, admitting it was a cruel and calculated act. She did not ask for forgiveness. She did not ask for anything. The letter ended with a simple, stark sentence. I am sorry for the sister I was. I hope for my own sake that I can become a better person. I read the letter 3 times. My first instinct was suspicion. Was this just another performance, another tactic to get something from me? I discussed it with Dr. Sharma in our next session. She asked me what I felt. I admitted that beneath the suspicion, I felt a flicker of something else, a sad, painful echo of the sisterly bond I had always wished for. Dr. Sharma pointed out that Paige's healing was Paige's responsibility. My only responsibility was to my own safety and well-being. I realized she was right. I did not need to decide if I believed Paige or not. I did not need to do anything at all. The letter was a data point, not a summons. For the first time, I had the power to simply observe, to wait, to protect myself without guilt. So I closed the email. I did not reply. The door to a future relationship was not slammed shut, but it was not thrown open either. It was simply left ajar, its final position to be determined by time and by actions, not just words. A year has passed since the day I walked out of that courtroom. My life today is unrecognizable, not because of grand, dramatic changes, but because of the quiet, profound presence of peace. My apartment, the piece of property that started this entire war, has transformed. It is no longer just a symbol of my independence, but a testament to my resilience. It is a home filled with the laughter of my chosen family, the scent of coffee from Sunday brunches, and the deep, comforting silence of a life lived on my own terms. The career I fought to protect has flourished. The respect I earned from my colleagues was solidified not just by my clinical skills, but by the quiet strength they witnessed. Last month, using a portion of the punitive damages awarded by the court, I worked with the hospital's foundation to establish a small scholarship fund. It is named the Miller Grant for Nursing Resilience, designed to help young nurses who are facing financial hardship while trying to build their careers. It was my way of transforming the ugliest chapter of my life into a source of support for others. It was my way of healing. I stand on my balcony sometimes looking out at the Denver skyline, and I think about the broken pieces of my past. The relationship with my parents remains a void, a necessary amputation to save the rest of my emotional health. Paige and I have not spoken, but the door remains slightly ajar. Her journey is her own, and I have found peace in letting it be just that. My own journey has taught me the most critical lesson of all. It is a lesson I practiced for years on my patients, but only recently learned to apply to myself. Sometimes to save a life, you have to make the toughest calls. You have to cut away what is toxic, you have to set unflinching boundaries, and you have to prioritize the well-being of the one person you will spend the rest of your life with, yourself. The anger I once felt has faded, replaced by a quiet strength. I am no longer defined by my role in their family as the responsible daughter, the fixer, the safety net. I am defined by my own choices, my own values, and my own unwavering belief that I am worthy of the peace I have created. The fight for my home taught me how to find a home within myself. And that is a place no one can ever threaten or take away. My story is a testament to the fact that sometimes the most compassionate act you can perform is to protect yourself. It is not selfish to set boundaries, it is an act of survival, and I know I am not alone in this experience. So, I want to ask you, have you ever been the designated responsible one in your family, expected to carry burdens that were not yours to bear? Have you ever had to make the difficult choice to put your own well-being first, even when it meant disappointing those you loved? Share your stories and your strength in the comments below. Your experience could be the validation someone else needs to hear today. And if this journey resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe. It helps more than you know. Thank you for listening, and remember, you are worthy of your own protection.